Okay, I think I'm sharing. Do you think I'm
You're
sharing?
sharing.
Okay. Now let me move all these extraneous boxes out of the way. So I am definitely not an expert in this. It is an interesting thing that Cornell has not had very much cut flower production research done. They had Chris Ween used to be here and was doing some trials on different species and so forth and looking at high tunnel production, but he retired and they haven't had much since then. And so I've talked with various people in extension and said, you know, there's a lot of cut flower growers out there. I think we need to be talking to them. And it's been interesting in how it's developed a lot with the cooperative extension people in terms of creating a listserv, in terms of creating a web page. I think we're still kind of just getting going, but we have those created now. And I'm also co-teaching with a cut flower grower who knows a lot more about specifics than I do, a cut flower class for the Small Farms program. But integrated pest management is kind of the same over all situations, but some of the specifics, it's become very clear to me that we don't know that much about pest management in cut flowers. There's a lot of species, there's a lot of pests, and there's not that many people working on it. So I'm gathering more and more information, and I'm happy to have other people say, you know, there's also these other things you might think about. And so please put questions in the chat. Carla's going to monitor the chat, and if something comes up where I clearly have confused people, she'll let me know, or if there's questions that seem relevant at the moment, but also there'll be time at the end and we can do questions then. So my part of the topic of risk is pest management risk. So I'm going to talk about integrated pest management. Oh, I forgot to say, I work for New York State Integrated Pest Management. I'm the coordinator for ornamentals. So I cover any kind of ornamental production for the whole state. Well, let's see now. Technology is a good thing. There we go. So the basics of integrated pest management are, to me, more important no matter the site, no matter the method of production, whether you're organic or conventional. Those are somewhat blending now, which is, I think, a good thing. And so I'm going to go through these basics and try and put in as many specifics as I can relative to cut flower growing, and then try and it always seems like some topics are really expanded and other ones are not as expanded, but hopefully it makes sense in the long run. So the basics of IPM are always starting with scouting and monitoring, figuring out what you can see there, and then figuring out what it is. So pest identification. And I will say that I use the word pest broadly. I'm defining it broadly. So some people use the word pest just to mean insects. I mean insects, diseases, weeds, birds, mammals, snails, whatever could be affecting your crop. And so once you've identified what it is, then you get to decide, all right, what options do I have for management, and which ones work best for me, and how can I put them together? So I've added this one, information and experience, to the top, and then the record keeping down at the bottom in terms of, and put them in red, because so many times you're going to hear me say what you do depends on your experience. So I'm sure that on the call or on the webinar, there are some people who are new to cut flower production. And so you may say, but I don't know any of these things. Well, the first time you put a flower in the ground, you'll start learning them, and make sure you keep records of them so that you know what it was, what you did, and whether or not it worked, which is the one that sometimes gets forgotten. So in terms of management options, there's cultural types of management, physical, biological, chemical. We're going to go over all of those. But this little triangle, seem to have a lot of triangles in pest management. This one, let's see, is to make the point of, you always start on a basis of cultural control, no matter what kind of production you're doing. And then look at physical, move through biological, and the smallest part and the last thing you do, not necessarily in time, but in terms of choosing your methods, is chemical, is pesticides. So IPM is neither conventional nor organic. You can use IPM in both situations, but in all cases, we're looking at the reduction of pesticide use to make sure that it's being used in the right place, at the right time, at the right level, to make sure that you get effective control, but no more than that. And if you don't need it, you don't use it. All right. The other thing I've learned from talking to classes, it's very easy for me to sit here in my office and say, well, you should do this, and you should do this, and you should do this, and you should do this. But it's a balance. So you can't do everything. You can't do everything at once. So one of the big things I think is having good enough information to help you choose what are the most important things to spend your time on first, or anywhere through this whole session. Is okay, you can't manage everything at the same time. So how do you know which is the most important? Which pest is likely to spread fastest? Which pest is likely to cause the most damage on your highest value crop? So another thing IPM brings in, oh, so sorry, I somehow have lost my slides on what is IPM. Maybe they're hiding beneath this, I'm not sure. That it involves looking at environmental effects, but also at ecological or at economic effects. Because if I can come up with the best pest management in the world, but it's too expensive, you're not going to do it. So we're kind of in that balance. I'm going to look backwards and see if I've missed something. Oh, there it is. How funny. It skipped right over it. I'll do this and then I'll go on to the next. Technology is wonderful when it works. So what is integrated pest management? The idea is it's a system that utilizes all the suitable control techniques to keep populations below economically injurious levels. So if you've got enough, just a small amount of damage and it's not causing any economic effect, perhaps nothing needs to be done. And when we're talking about ornamentals, where how pretty they are makes a big difference, often that economically injurious level is very low. It doesn't take very many insects to get to that point, or it doesn't take much disease to get to that point. But it's still something you figure in there. I was just saying, looking at economic and environmentally sound, and the production and user objectives are what help you decide which of those tools you're going to use at what level and so forth. All right, now we'll get back there. So let's start with talking about monitoring it and seeing what you have. It's the basis of it all. And if you're not looking, then things get missed. And so the two kinds of main pieces are observation and then some trapping. Excuse me. But one of the things and experience always. So the idea to me behind monitoring is, I don't know if you can see my cursor. It's on the left side of my screen, a plant with a little bit of thrips damage. That might even be too much thrips damage for you, but if you can catch it at this point and you don't get to the point where on the right side of the screen, you've got so much damage that it's clearly affecting the economic value of that crop. That's why we wanted to be monitoring. I always say you will almost never see the first one of anything. You'll never see the first aspect of the disease. You'll probably never see the first insect, but you want to be pretty close to that, as close as you can get. So as you gain experience, you'll start learning which crops have which problems and what they look like and when to look for them. I also know that I talk really fast, and this probably all seems like fire hose teaching, but that's kind of the way we end up because there's so much information. So one of the first pieces in terms of good monitoring, good scouting, is to train anyone who's in the field what to look for. And one of the things that comes back, and again, it depends, you may be the only person in your field. But if you've got people working for you, is also reward them for reporting. You don't want them to say, it's like, oh, I saw something and I'm worried about that maybe they'll think it's my fault. I don't know, whatever, but I don't want to tell. No, you need to say, we want you to be looking, anything you see that looks unusual or different, please tell us, because it could be the beginning of an issue. And I'm working on a greenhouse scouting school. And one of the things we started thinking about was looking at a field from the macro image and then looking at the micro. So if you just go into a field, a grower that's been doing it for a while can look down a row and say, I see something way down there that doesn't look quite right. I probably couldn't walk into the field and notice that, but that's part of the training is that plant off color? Is that variety not looking the way it's supposed to? And then you can get into the smaller one where you're looking at individual plants and so forth. but the intent is not to have to look at every plant. I put this little picture of a flower field in the bottom to remind myself to talk about, like, where do you look? And when you've got plants grown in the soil compared to this greenhouse where they're up on a bench, if you're trying to look at the lower leaves, you're laying on your face. And so it's very difficult to look, certainly impossible to look at every plant with all the detail that could be possible. Look down in between plants, look at the bottom leaves, look at the top. So again, experience helps knowing where you should look on a particular species and kind of what to look for. And if you can create a scouting plan in advance, that helps you to figure out how you might do this scouting. So it's always nice to say, oh yes, look, you could make this little diagram of, we're going to go down this row and look at these plants, and that's what we're going to do every time. And we have some consistency, so we know we're going to pick up things as we see them. That sounds great. The other reason for putting this greenhouse picture in here is, here's an example of a situation where it is almost impossible to scout efficiently, because so I don't see aisles on the side. Whoops, that's interesting. I don't see aisles on the side. I don't see much in the way of aisles between, unless he's got movable benches. He could just about scout these plants. He can't really get down too far into them, but there's no way he's scouting the plants over on the far side. So if you've planned out how your rows are going to be set up or whatever, you can kind of figure out a way of, how am I going to get through them. This one, again, you're not going to skip from this row over 2 rows over here, because you'd have to step over the plants. So coming up with a plan in advance will probably help you. Again, here comes an experience again. What do you already know? Do you know, once you've grown them, you start learning, okay, this crop gets aphids, or this crop gets powdery mildew. Well, so those are the crops to look at first for aphids and powdery mildew. You don't have to look at all of them if you know you're going to see it first on this particular crop. So planning out, figuring out what you can do for who's going to be doing it, how you're going to be doing it, when you're going to be doing it, where in the field you're going to be looking, helps you to make it be, helps you make it happen, also helps make it be consistent. And I found this, it's an advertisement for sticky cards. We talk a lot about sticky cards in greenhouses. And if you also have a greenhouse for your operation, you might use sticky cards for trapping insects. You can use them for trapping them and removing them, but mostly what we're looking at is trapping for monitoring. And up here it says, last all year round, even in rain, or completely coated with insects or dust. There's 2 pieces in there that are important. If you look at the one picture over to the right that's completely covered with insects, that doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't, unless you know that I put it out yesterday and today I looked at it and it's that covered, then you've got a problem. But if it's been there it's just been accumulating insects, and especially if it's been accumulating dust, it's not going to do anything for you. And so in a field situation, the dust and all the other insects that are out there that are not pest insects might make using something like yellow sticky traps much less effective or efficient. It's not impossible. I've seen people do it, but it's much more likely to be useful inside some kind of a structure, and one that probably doesn't have open sides. But trap crops are another thing, and this is something that I started looking at. And one of the things that Carla had originally said is, oh, Japanese beetles, everyone's interested in Japanese beetles. Yep. And we don't have great management for them, partly because they can fly so well. If you've got turf areas near your beds, that especially if they're irrigated, that's a great place for the larvae to survive. That's where the adults will lay their eggs. But even not having it on your own property, having irrigated turf areas, doesn't mean that your neighbors don't, or they'll, as I said, they'll fly in from quite long distances, and it's the adults that are the problem in cut flowers. So I said, well, okay, so, and there are insecticides that you can use for Japanese beetles, and a lot of hand removal gets done, but depending on how long your rows are, that might be a problem. So trap crops are the idea that you have something that is more attractive than the crop you're trying to produce. So looking up Japanese beetles, I found 4 o'clocks mentioned, and I'll make another comment about that. Zinnias, scented geraniums. And one thing they said about geraniums is, well, they like the flowers, and if you're looking at scented geraniums, you're often looking at the leaves. Well, maybe. There's information out there that says 4 o'clocks are toxic to Japanese beetles, and so when they feed on them, then it kills them. I looked up to see if I could find scientific background for that, and they said, as far as anyone can tell, it's coming from an old USDA report, which really doesn't say anything about them toxic, so it seems not to be true. And zinnia is like, well, okay, so if zinnias are your primary crop, that's not a good trap crop unless you have an earlier planting that you can use to attract the beetles, and then you can get rid of them. Then you can get rid of them, anything that's on that trap crop. So the other thing that I'll tell you about the research on trap crops is you also have to pay attention to what they're using as their crop. So if they're looking at strawberries and your trap crop is, or your crop that you're trying to produce is zinnias, and whatever the insect is like zinnias better than strawberries, the data that they've got in that research paper are not very useful to you, because the comparison is only to the thing that they've been testing it against. So you can find information on things. There's some listed here: radish or nasturtium for flea beetles, and nasturtium for aphids. Again, there's a bunch of kinds of aphids, so I can't imagine that it attracts them all. Tarnished plant bug, and I put strawberry in there because that's what they are comparing it to. Buckwheat or white mustard. Those are all things you can try. But the other thing is, what do you see on your own farm? Do you have a crop that is clearly most attractive to something? And can you make a planting of that on the outside edges, so something flying in will stop there, and those you're not going to harvest, but you actually are going to control the insects on those plants and not on the ones you're trying to harvest. So there is quite a lot of information out there about trap crops, which are almost exclusively for insect management, by the way. But I think it's one where this is going to take a certain amount of experimentation in terms of figuring out what works best for you. I see there's some information on sticky cards, and there's lots of companies that produce sticky cards, and some of the biological supply places or agricultural supply places will also sell them. You can find quite a lot of different prices also, by the way. So the other thing that trap crops are good for, and this is a little easier to deal with because you're not looking necessarily at you're not looking at damage, you're looking at it bringing in biological controls to help control things on your farm, is what crops you can use that will bring in beneficial insects. So I found cornflower. I wrote this one, I don't know if there's scientific background on cornflower for bringing in spiders and ground beetles, which will both work on pests that are living in the soil. Sweet alyssum is really good for hoverflies. Sweet alyssum might not be something that you're ever going to grow to sell, but you can interplant it in with your other plants, or you can put rows of it in between the rows of your crop, or you can put it around the edges, or even in a slightly an area that's not quite in your production area, but close enough, because hoverflies will fly, and you'll get good aphid control from the hoverfly larvae. Sunflowers, they listed for lacewings and lady beetles. It also is listed as being a trap crop for the bad stink bugs. And so if it's attracting bad stink bugs, maybe it will also attract good ones. But unfortunately, if you've got a crop that you're trying to produce and it's bringing in something that you don't want, then again, you have to balance those. Oops, I swear this is hopping over things. It is absolutely hopping over pages. So how do you include trap crops in your production? You can plant them earlier so that they're more mature, and sometimes things that are flowering earlier will pull in more pests. I found some interesting research on planting them late. They were looking at planting mullein for tarnished plant bug control, and they put it in late. So you're getting fall control. So you're reducing the population before they go through the winter and then appear again in the spring or summer. And so you can put them around the edges. again, some insects come in from the outside every year, and they'll stop at the first thing that they see that they like. And so that might be a way to protect the rest of your production area from those pests. But the big thing is you still have to have some kind of control. If you just have a trap crop and pull all those pests to the trap crop, once they start feeding on it, they will move away from it. So it's not a question of just plant them and then let them go and ignore them. It's plant them, keep an eye on them, scout them, and then control whatever's there. And this is an example from a greenhouse, but it's a chrysanthemum greenhouse, and they have an earlier flowering or earlier planted chrysanthemum variety. They were looking at thrips management. And so this plant is pulling thrips before they go to any of the other plants. And in the top, they're using it to apply biological controls on, and the bottom, they actually show they had them in flats, so they're not planted in the ground, but they had a plastic bag around the base of it already so that they could bag it and take it out that way. You don't want to take it out, carrying it out and letting thrips fall off of it onto your plants as you take it out. So they'd planned their system for a trap crop that they could do some management on, and also use as a collection point, if that works. It's harder in a field. Collection point to then remove them and remove the pests. So I would say trap cropping is useful for identifying what you've got and early. It may be useful for doing some removal or some control of the pest, but it's probably not a standalone management tool. I always laugh about the fact that my phone never rings until I'm on a webinar. So that's some ideas of, okay, so Kathy says she's left small mulberry trees and fence rows, and then the pulling insects. The question is then, do you treat them there, or do you just let them stay there? Any other questions on sort of monitoring and trapping or trapping?
So there was a comment, actually, Kathy said that she's had very good results from leaving a small mulberry tree in fence rows, and the insects love them.
And that's what I was wondering, if she's actually doing some control there or just leaving them there and letting the insects stay there, which they might. All right, so the next question, now you've gone out and you've scouted your area, and now you found some things, and how do you know what's causing the damage? Well, eventually you'll start to learn them, but we always seem to get new ones. So knowing what you have helps you to determine what you're going to do about it. And the big thing about one of the big pieces about identification of what the pest is looking for patterns in the field and on the plants. So there's types of damage. That's something to note when you're scouting. Are you getting holes? Or are you getting stippling on the leaves? Are the plants wilting? Are you getting spots? Is the foliage distorted? And then also in the field, is it on a single species or on multiple species? Is it on a single cultivar or multiple cultivars? Is it in just one part of the field, or is it randomly scattered over the whole field? Is it on the whole field? And then is it the whole plant or just part of the plant? All of those things will help tell you something about what's going on. So you can see on these chrysanthemums, they've got fusarium, and it's only coming in on one side. So it's a root rot, and it affects the uptake of nutrients and so forth. It's not affecting all the roots, so it's also not affecting the whole plant. So that helps tell you something about what it might be. This greenhouse picture is one where, so you've got very dramatic distortion of the foliage. It's kind of strappy shaped. It could be a virus that does that. It could be an herbicide application that does that. And it could be some other things. So when I look at this greenhouse, it's almost impossible that the entire place would all have virus at once, unless it came in on the seed. And that's not very common. So it's probably not viruses. It'd be unlikely that someone would use an herbicide inside the greenhouse, so it's probably not that. What it is in this case is actually the heater is malfunctioning and it's producing ethylene. So it's the whole greenhouse. So that usually tells you that it's something that's abiotic. It's not an organism that's causing it, because they tend to be much more spotty. And the other thing you start learning about patterns is, so, these are all spots on the leaves. So you could say I have spots on the leaves, and I would start asking you questions like, on this upper one, do they have yellow halos around them? that suggests it's a bacterial disease. Is it tiny spots that are sort of all coalescing into larger ones? That actually is spider mite damage in this case, but it could be another sucking insect. If you have spots that are sort of artistic, they have rings or different shapes that are kind of consistent. This is a virus disease. This is tobacco mosaic on peony. And then this one with the centers are dying out, but there's lots of different possibilities for fungal leaf spots, but this is a fungal leaf spot. So sometimes I think for diagnosis, it's not that you look at it and say immediately, I know what it is, but you look at it and you say, okay, I'm pretty sure it's in this group, and now maybe I can find out some more information about it. Or something that I didn't include in today is you might need to send in a sample to a diagnostic clinic so that they can actually culture it out and tell you this is what it is. Because if you are not sure, and you've got 4 possibilities here for what it might be, how you would go about managing it is different in all 4 cases. And so there's certainly no point in spending time and energy on a management system that doesn't match the pest. So you do really want to know what it is. So just in terms of, again, looking at some of these patterns and starting to learn some of the ways to differentiate things, different types of insects will give you different types of damage. So we're used to thinking about chewing insects and sucking insects, and there's a few other things that they can do in terms of oviposition damage or distorting plant parts or transmitting diseases that may also result in management of the insect pest. So the 2 kinds of mouth parts that we're most interested in terms of plant damaging insects are chewing and piercing sucking. And piercing sucking, so they're actually inserting essentially a straw into the plant. Some of them, aphids, insert their mouth parts directly into the veins, so they're doing direct removal of the plant sap. And often that doesn't cause very much doesn't cause very much damage. Whereas spider mite, for example, is inserting its mouth parts into a cell and removing the contents. So you'll see a white spot left, and then sometimes in the insect itself, you'll see the green from the chlorophyll still there. That's true. It's 2-spotted spider mites. Piercing sucking mouth parts seem to be more often associated with spreading of diseases, many of the viruses, because they're actually injecting saliva into the plant at the same time as they're removing plant materials. And so sometimes they can inject virus particles or some other diseases. There's a few other things that can be carried than something that has chewing mouth parts, like fungus gnat larvae transmitting root rots, but it's often the piercing sucking type. So our favorite Japanese beetles are clearly chewing insects. This is an aphid with its mouth parts stuck into a leaf. And this is the spider mite damage, where you can get the feeling that it's sitting there taking all the contents out of a cell, and then the next cell and the next cell, so you get little white spots. And this is an example, the one on the pepper, and we more often see it on fruit than on flowers. There are little dimples along there. Those are all oviposition sites for an insect. And the other piece, of course, is if they're laying an egg in something, there's something that's going to grow inside there. So in this case, you might see the oviposition sites first, and if you open that pepper up, you would find that there are larvae in there feeding on the inside. The other one is distortion of foliage, and that can happen if the insect is feeding in the buds, or if it's injecting toxic saliva that causes the plants to be more malformed. And again, it's usually an insect issue, and it might be one where the only way to control the distortion is actually to control the insects. Again, if the distortion is happening on a plant part that you're not selling, it's maybe not as important, but foliage is important in cut flowers, more so than in vegetable crops, for example. The other thing to think about insects, and this has to do with how your insect problems might spread, is how they're moving around. So a small mite that has to crawl might not be able to get from plant to plant. So you might not see very quick spread of that. So it's easier to, if you find it and you've got damage on one plant or in one area, if you can manage it there, you can prevent them from moving to any other plants. if they're flying, especially if they're flying, and even if they're jumping and can jump fairly far, being able to control that damage to one area is tougher, because in the process often of going into management, you may make them disperse and they'll fly off to other places. And then the other piece is what's being vectored. This is not, we don't think about this very much, but this is an example in a greenhouse where this is a white fly. And if you look at those lumps on its feet, those are all mites, and it's actually carrying mites from plant to plant. Those mites could never crawl from plant to plant. They're way too small. But because they have, it's the whitefly Uber, because they have something that will fly them from place to place, they'll be spread much more easily than they would by themselves. In terms of diseases, we're interested in a couple different things. How do they get into the plant? And then kind of what they can do in once they're in there. Fungi are multicellular, so if you see fuzz on a plant, if you see mycelium growth on a plant, it is a fungus. And so we sometimes lump them all together, but they do act differently. And so in order to try and determine what it is you've got and what you need to be able to, what you can do about it, again, some of these hints are kind of useful. So fungi are multicellular. They can create their own entry sites. So a fungus can actually either push its way into a plant or dissolve the surface of the plant to get in. Bacteria are either single or small cells, a few cells. They don't have the ability to make their own entry points to a plant. So they have to come in through natural openings, or what is much more common is through wounds. Okay, you're producing cut flowers, you are cutting things off. So you are always creating wounds. So how do you prevent bacteria from getting in there? One of the things is to make sure that your tools are clean. And so if you're cutting off one plant before you go to the next plant, you might clean your tools. The other thing is, and I'm not sure that I put this in here, but I'm always saying it is, if you have an area that has a pest problem and another area that doesn't, always work in the clean one first and move to the dirty one last, because you are much less likely to spread it. And we're excellent vectors. We can carry insects around on us, but we also have tools in our hands that might have contacted disease plants, and you can spread them to other plants. So, and any kind of equipment can also, so clean your equipment off, but always work clean to dirty. Viruses are less even than a single cell, and they usually need something to vector them into a plant. One of those things is us. And so there are some that are mechanically transmitted, where just, yes, handling plants. One of the ones that's kind of the most amazing is tobacco mosaic virus will survive in dried tobacco. And so if you have somebody who smokes and then comes into the greenhouse and hasn't washed their hands, they could potentially have tobacco mosaic virus on their hands from the cigarettes. It's amazing that it can survive that long in that tissue, but it does. But some things have very short survival outside of a host or the vector, which is to our advantage. And then nematodes are an odd thing sometimes to put in with diseases. They seem more like insects, but they've always been traditionally studied in plant pathology departments. They're very, very small worms, and they have mouth parts that will let them get into plants. There are both good, I was going to say insects, because there are both good and bad nematodes. We have some that we use to control insects, and I think there's even a nematode you can use to control Japanese beetle larvae. So they can make their own wounds, or they can make it themselves in, and they usually feed in the roots or the foliage. I liked this table because it kind of goes over some of the things that are important in terms of looking at how a disease can get into your plants and then spread in your plants. And then another big one is how it survives. So anything that says it survives in crop residue automatically suggests that you need to do some kind of removal of residue as part of your management. It's part of the cultural management. So that if you're leaving crop residue there and it has resistant fungal structures either in the plant material or they've gone down into the soil, which makes it even more difficult. But if they're in the crop residue, if you leave it there, now you've got inoculum ready to start the disease system again in your plants. So removing those is very important. Some survive in the soil, which is even more complicated. And then some have alternate hosts. So they may have to switch from one to the other. And so knowing what the alternate host is, which might be a weed, if you can control that weed, then you've stopped the life cycle. Also, dispersal is how they're getting moved around. Do they get moved around by wind or rain or insects? And then how they can infect a plant, which I've pretty much already talked about. So you can see fungi have a lot more methodologies of survival and dispersal than bacteria and viruses do as you kind of come along the series. And then nematodes also. And the other piece here in terms of dispersal being dispersed on equipment, I think this should be included, perhaps maybe also over in bacteria and fungi, but that if you move soil around, you may also move nematodes around. And so, for example, golden nematode is a pest of potatoes on Long Island, but they quarantined Long Island potatoes so that they would not spread that nematode that was in the plant and then potentially also in soil. And this is another hint or trick that you can use to determine if you have a bacterial disease or a fungal disease. This is bacterial streaming. In this case, it's in the vascular tissue. So they've cut the stem and put it in water. And if you don't disturb the water, you will see the bacteria coming out of the vascular tissue. You can also do it in a droplet of water if you take a leaf spot and cut the edge. You don't want just dead tissue. You want the edge where it's just infecting the tissue. You will also see the bacteria coming out of that cut edge. And as I said, sometimes knowing part of the answer helps you figure out what you're going to do about it, even if you don't know exactly which bacterium it is or which fungus it is or whatever. And then not to forget weeds. Some of the reason we look at some differences in weeds is basically how to manage them. So we tended to divide them up into either grass weeds or broadleaf weeds. And then also look at the life cycle. So a perennial weed is one that's going to keep coming back. They're much more difficult to control. And so they're ones that if you're going to spend any time doing any kind of weed control, make sure you're controlling your perennials. They also tend to get larger. They tend to do a better job of taking over an area. Biennials will be there for 2 years and then will be gone, but they also seed themselves. So that's another thing where they start looking perennial because they're seeding themselves. Annuals can also seed themselves and seem kind of perennial. And we divide annuals up into winter and summer annuals. There are some like chickweed, for example, is happily growing now and it will overwinter and then will be there in the spring early. So if you are going to control chickweed and you saw it in the spring and said, oh, I'm going to control it now. Well, it's almost done with its season. If you can prevent it from flowering, that's still an advantage. If it's a summer annual and you see it in the fall and you're like, well, I better control that, it's probably done growing. So there's no point. And chickweed is not one that's a huge problem. It's a low growing one. And so you might leave it. But so knowing something about the life cycle will also help you determine something about the how to manage them. So, okay, any questions on sort of those aspects? I can't see very many faces, so can't tell if if your heads have all exploded. Fran's head hasn't exploded yet, but she knows all this stuff. Some of it anyway. We all know little bits of some of it. Okay, so the next question then is, so what are you going to do about it? Okay, I've done my scouting. I found these things. I got to do something. And so I've mentioned before the 4 types we sort of clump all management methodologies into cultural, physical, biological, or chemical. And we emphasize the cultural, physical, and biological controls and minimize the chemical ones. And I put this little note in, okay, some or most of them require advanced planning. There are a few things that's like, oh my gosh, I've got a disaster and I have to go out there and do something. It's always better to have planned what you're going to do for management beforehand. In some cases, that will prevent the problem, which is better than dealing with a problem. And in others, it just means that you've got things ready to go. So when you see it, you can do something about it. I was looking at faces and I didn't have to click there. So this disease triangle is another one. I said we have lots of triangles. the concept of the only point at which you get a disease, and I think this does apply to insects in many cases also, is you have to have a host that's susceptible. So if you're growing dahlias and there's a disease of stalks, it doesn't matter how much disease of stalks you've got around, it's not going to affect your dahlias. That dahlia is not susceptible to that. And there are some diseases that are very specific to the crop that they grow on. In fact, even some for powdery mildews, we call them all powdery mildew, but there's a lot of different species, and there is a powdery mildew for lots of different types of plants. So it's worth knowing that, because if you've got powdery mildew on one plant and it's not going to spread to the next row over because it's a different species, you don't need to do the control on that next row over if you're using a pesticide. You can just use it on the one row that's the disease, that's the susceptible host. You also have to have the pathogen there. So if it's not there, even if you have a perfectly susceptible host and great environment, you're still not going to get the disease. And then the environment is the third piece that makes it all work. And that's where we spend some time talking about susceptible hosts in terms of thinking about management, some about whether or not keeping the pathogens out. But in this case, I think we spend a lot of time talking about how to modify the environment so that it is not conducive to that disease and potentially also insect either surviving or coming in at all. So the first question is, it doesn't seem like pest management, but I'm a big tent thinker, I guess, about pest management. So the question is, like, what do you know about your site? So do you know what the water quality is? Do you know what the pH and alkalinity are? Those might influence what you're doing or how a pesticide might work, for example. Or it might affect something about the nutrition of the plant. And now you've got plants that are stressed, and stressed plants get more insects and potentially more diseases also. If your water, what is your water source? And is there a potential for disease contamination of that source? So if there are some diseases that are very frequently found in ponds that you can spread to your plants when you're using it as irrigation water. If you're using a well, then maybe that's less likely to have any contamination. The same thing with soil. Do you know what the electrical conductivity is? And that's actually a measure of what nutrients are in the soil. And does it change over time? Do you know what the pH of your soil is? Do you know something about the fertility? And you can get soil and water tests, have soil and water tests done that will tell you all this information. Sometimes more information than you can almost deal with, and sometimes more information in a format that you might feel like, I'm not quite sure what they're telling me. And also, I think one of the things to do in terms of finding a place to have your soil and water tested is if you can find a lab, and most states have a lab usually associated with their universities, and some are better than others at having as one of the options when you tell them what crop it is you're growing, having cut flowers. So if you're asking for information on nutrition and whether or not you should be applying phosphorus or potassium, and they're looking at your site as if you're growing alfalfa, the answers may not come back correctly. You'll get the numbers, and if you can take the numbers and go search for yourself to find out what you need to add, that's one thing. But it may not. It's better if you can find a place that actually has cut flowers as an option on their soil and water tests. You can also have tests done of the plant material itself. When we're talking about things like nutrition, knowing what's actually in the plant is more useful than knowing what's in the soil, because just because it's in the soil doesn't mean the plant will take it up. It may be more expensive to do that, and sometimes what you need is, I need to know today what's in my plant because I need to do something about it because I'm getting yellow foliage or whatever. Almost never do you get your responses back that quickly. But again, doing this over time and checking with some regularity. Do you check once a year? Do you check every 5 years? Do you check more often than that? Or do you say, okay, I just amended this soil with compost and now I want to see what the nutrient levels are. How you determine how often you're going to do it is kind of up to you. But the more you know about your site, and I'm sure there's other factors that I haven't included in here. What's the shade pattern? How many hours of sun do you get? at any part of your field in any given part of the year. Those things are all important. And the more you know about it, the more that will help you kind of determine what's going on with your plants and what you might do. So now we're looking at cultural management. So we're looking at environmental factors in large part. And so where did this picture come from? I don't know why it's there. So air movement it affects disease spread. So I'm going to see if I can move it away. No, I can't. Oops, sorry. We're just going to leave it there. So this is looking at a disease plant so it has spores. So it's got a fungus. It's just that it's spread by spores and they're windborne. So if you've got a disease plant here and the general air movement is toward these other plants, the spores will get carried there. And then what that's showing you below is the same disease plant, but then spores that have spread to these other plants. So that's one point about air movement in terms of disease spread. We're also interested in relative humidity, and that has a lot to do with air movement in terms of how the plants are grown. So wind direction is one piece that's important. Row orientation, whether it's blocking the wind or allowing the wind to move down the rows or the air to move down the rows. Plant spacing, how far apart they are and how much air movement you can get around them. And then weed management. In this case, we're just looking at weeds as additional plants that are providing humidity and causing the humidity in an area to be higher because you've got more plant material together. So when you're looking again, so for air movement and relative humidity, space is money. So you tend to put plants in fairly tightly so that you're getting the highest number of cut stems per unit area. That makes perfect sense. But it also means that you've got plants that are pretty close together. So the likelihood of there being very good air movement through these plants, you'll get some air movement down the rows, but through the plants is going to be much more difficult. So that's not necessarily something that you change, but just keep in mind if you're looking for plant diseases that the tighter the area, the more likely you'll have diseases that like high humidity. They don't all like high humidity. And so I was just out on a flower farm and I've had this conversation, it seems like over a couple of days in terms of, they were talking about spacing peonies and some seem really tight and they seem to work. Excuse me, and other ones, they said, no, we're getting too much botrytis. So they were spreading them out farther apart. And there's also, as you change the spacing on the plant, it may produce more or less flowers. There's some aspects in there too. So again, it's always a balance between what you're trying to do for pest management, what you're trying to do for production. The other aspect of environment that is often, that can have a big effect on disease management is how you're watering and how you're doing irrigation. So this picture is of drip irrigation. So in this case, the water's going more directly to the roots. And so it's unlikely that it's going to land on the foliage. And many diseases, require free water on the leaves for a certain amount of time. And sometimes it seems like an amazingly long time, 8 or 12 hours. But we're not necessarily talking about just a droplet of water. It's that there's even a thin film of sometimes even just high humidity over the leaves for that period for the spores to germinate and then to infect the plant. So if you can keep water off your foliage, in a dry year, that's easier because if you're using drip irrigation. In a wet year, you don't have much control over that. But if you can keep water off the foliage, that will dramatically affect the disease development. And this past summer, it was dry in the beginning of the season. And so there's some diseases that people normally get that they either didn't get at all or didn't get until much later. So there are some diseases that like high humidity, like botrytis and downy mildew and alternaria. And there's some things that like low humidity, like powdery mildew and spider mites. Spider mites are typically the biggest problem when it's dry and dusty. They seem to like dust also. I don't know, it's just that the dryness goes along with the dust, but they seem in dusty areas, like if you've got a roadway or something where you're getting dust deposited on plants, you often will find more spider mites. So water movement, and again, this is another point in terms of disease management, is splashing. And so if you've got a diseased plant and rainfall comes down and hits the soil, you get splashing, like the little picture there. It will splash disease organisms up onto the stem or the foliage of other plants. So then you need to think about, how do you prevent splashing? And often preventing splashing is done by covering the soil. So it might be landscape fabric or plastic or some other kind of organic mulch, so that when the water droplets hit, they don't hit soil and then they can't splash it up. So there's discussion on where to get your soil tested and your water tested, and it depends on where you are. And it may depend on what's available to you also. You can send them to other states. You don't have to send them within your own state too. So here's an example of reducing soil splash and weed growth at the same time. So both there's a plastic mulch and then an organic mulch. Well, both of them will work. And then another piece in terms of temperature that relates more to insect management is, how fast do the populations develop based on what the temperature is? And many insects, when they get warmer temperatures up to a certain point, will produce eggs or go from generation to generation much more quickly. So the top one is for two-spotted spider mites, and this is how many days it takes to go from an egg to another egg. So if it's 54, it takes 40 days for one egg to hatch out, survive, lay egg, get mate, lay eggs, and then the next eggs are ready to hatch. When you're up at 86, it's only 7 days. So if you have one spider mite at 86 degrees, within a couple of weeks, you can have many, 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 many spider mites. So what it's telling you, and what it's telling me, is the warmer it is, again, up to a point, you'll start seeing that number increase again when it gets too hot for the insect. What that's saying is, you need to be thinking about what the potential for your insect development is in terms of how fast you need to do some kind of management. And so the warmer it is, usually the more ready you need to be to do something. So this foxglove aphid, and aphids are even worse in that they don't have to hatch out of eggs. They have live birth. And in fact, they're actually born pregnant. They take a few days to mature. I just saw Fran's face, which is the face we usually get when we talk about aphids being born pregnant. It takes a couple days to mature, and then they're ready to produce live babies that just take a few days to mature, and they're ready to produce live babies. So again, at 77, you're getting a development time from adult to adult of 7 days. Here's one, in this case, foxglove aphid doesn't like it as hot. So as it gets hotter, that starts to increase. So that's maybe an advantage when you're outside and you don't have too much control over the temperature. But that's the other point of, how do you control temperature when you're growing in the field? Can you plant earlier? That's one thing. Shade is a possibility, but that's not something that gets done very often. This is another aspect of using temperature to reduce pest levels. This is a place where we did some solarization before we put some beds in at Cornell Agritech in Geneva. And it looks like white plastic. It's actually clear plastic. And for solarization, you use clear plastic because the intent is for the sun to come in, create a greenhouse effect, and to actually heat the soil. You don't want to heat the plastic. You want the soil to heat up. So we had tilled it. It was moist enough, because you need it to be moist enough for things to be in an active state. And then one of the questions was, can you get decent solarization in a relatively short period of time in the Northeast? Because many places they do solarization. They either do it for a whole season or they do it longer. And this it was only in for a couple of months, I think, and you can see the results. And so in some areas we got very good solarization. It killed the weed seeds. This is an area that had been fallow for a while and was quite weedy. And the lack of weeds lasted remarkably long. Things didn't seem to pop up again once it was opened up. However, we learned that purslane loves it under there. So in an area that had purslane, the solarization didn't do anything. it actually seemed to be quite happy. When it got high enough and it hit the plastic, it burned it a bit, but other than that, it didn't seem to control it. So the intent with solarization is to get the soil temperature up to 100, 120, at least 6 inches down. And there are some disease organisms that'll also be killed at those temperatures. So it will kill some weed seeds, and it will kill some disease organisms. And then in terms of crop rotation, we kind of consider that cultural. Again, you're looking at that triangle and you're removing the host in this case. And so you need to know which crops are susceptible to the diseases. This is, again, soil-borne diseases. And how long does the organism last in the soil? That's the piece we don't always know. And sometimes it seems to be remarkably long. That if you have an organism that has developed in the soil and is surviving in the soil, that coming back even in 2 years isn't enough, maybe 3 years isn't enough. We don't always know, but the idea is to put something that's not susceptible to that disease in the area for as long as possible, so that you're essentially starving out those organisms and they can't survive too long. But it often cut flower farms are relatively small, have lots of different crops that they're producing, some of which are related to each other, and so rotation gets to be kind of a difficult thing. This one definitely takes planning though in advance. And then debris removal, I kind of talked about that a little bit already. And this is one, when I was talking about it last year in class, I think I caused someone to have terrible angst. They were saying, I just can't get it all up all the time for all the crops. And so, yes, it's where balance comes in. And so how much debris do you need to remove? This is in terms of stems and leaves. There's some thought of, okay, if the plant material is not diseased and you're going to till it in and use it as a source of nutrients, that's great. So in that situation, you don't need to remove any. But if there's a disease problem in that area, and especially if it's one where the disease overwinters in the debris, you need to remove it and take out as much as you can. In terms of when, usually sooner is later than better, even in terms of like cutting down the foliage of peony for certain diseases before it actually has died out. You get it out of there and remove it. And again, you're removing it from the area. What are you doing with it? I probably wouldn't put it in my compost if I was putting compost back into the soil, unless I knew that I could compost that, make that compost really, really hot throughout the whole mass of the compost. You can have another compost area, which is compost that just breaks down and you're not going to move it back onto your field, is a possibility. Bagging it, that's another, that there's a cost to that. So there's other things. Burning it doesn't happen very often. I guess you could. And then how do you make it easier to remove the debris? So if you put down landscape fabric or something, it's a lot easier to collect it, or plastic. If you have an organic mulch, it's probably more difficult to try and to collect it or remove it. And then the other question is, okay, so now if you've got something that's in the soil, do you ever try removing soil? That's a huge issue. It's usually a last ditch effort, that there's something that's such a problem and you don't have any other way to use that area, that you would actually look at soil removal. Oops. All right, looks like it's mostly a discussion of testing labs, and everybody has their favorite, or maybe you don't yet, but you'll find one. So let's talk about disinfectants and ways to clean. So sanitation in terms of, we talked about sanitation in terms of debris removal, and then there's sanitation in terms of cleaning things. So this gets used more for things like pots if you're starting your own seedlings, or tools or surfaces if you're potting and planting up on a certain surface. So the whole point is to actually clean it before you disinfect it. So you're trying to get the organic matter off and the dirt off before you're trying to disinfect it, because organic matter in general will break down the disinfectants or tie them up. And so you're not getting the effect that you want on the surface that you're trying to control. You need to choose the correct one for what you're trying to control. And sometimes you know that, and sometimes you don't. Some of them are pretty general, like quaternary ammonium compounds and so forth. You need to know how long it takes for them to work. Do you put it on the surface and it has to sit there for 5 to 30 minutes? If it's something you're using to clean your tools, that's not going to work because you're using them. You need something that happens in more or less instantaneously. If you're using something like a solution that you're soaking pots in or dipping pots in, what causes it to break down? Is it broken down in sunlight? Is it broken down with organic matter? And is the pH or the alkalinity of the water important into its ability to work? And then in some cases, we want to know whether or not they're going to leave residues. Residues is great if you're cleaning a surface that you don't want, that something else like a bacteria or fungus could land on, and you'd like it to kill it. But unfortunately, if you're putting plants on it and it also affects your plants, you don't want there to be any residual action. And knowing how corrosive they are, if you're putting them on things like benches or tools, is important. So chlorine bleach is, so these are all things that you can use: chlorine bleach, quaternary ammonium, hydrogen dioxide, and alcohol for tools. They are pesticides if you're using them to kill something by law. And so because you're using it as a pesticide, you need one that's labeled for a pesticide. And so there is chlorine bleach that's not the kind you buy in the grocery store. It's actually labeled as a pesticide. This issue it's a huge issue in a way because it is important in terms of not having accidental effects on your plants, but also there's cost issues that go along with it and legalities. You'll hear more me say this again later, I'm sure. Let's see. I don't know how I'm doing. We'll see. I may or may not get as far as I think. In terms of physical management, there's physical removal and prevention of access. So here's my picture for actual removal. You can go out and hoe your weeds. You can pick off your bugs. I've never seen anybody actually going, and this is somebody that's probably a scientist trying to collect things, but actually aspirating them into a little collector. You might do that if you wanted to know what it is, but you're probably not going to do that as a way to remove them. But bug picking and hoeing are pretty common. One way to protect your plants by not letting things in, so preventing access, is to use row covers. And there's lots of different styles. You can use them over hoops. You can use them flat over the crop. It depends a lot on the crop. But there's also going to be lots of factors to consider. So they're usually designed to allow some light through. It may not be as much as it would have without it, and to allow water through. But then when you start talking about ease of harvest, if you've got something over your plants, it becomes perhaps just untenable. And so it may be a question of you're going to cover your plants until they start to bloom, and then you're going to uncover them, and you will have had protection for part of the season, and then you're at the point where you're cutting the part that's for sale, and hopefully you won't have any damage on those parts. And then cost is always an issue as well. Mulches are another way of preventing plants, in this case, preventing weeds from growing around the plants. People have very strong opinions on whether to use plastic or landscape fabric or organic mulches. There's questions of cost, there's questions of preference, there's questions of reusability. So if it's landscape fabric, can you take it up every year, store it, and then put it back out? And then there's also, if plastic is much harder to do that with, it tears more easily, it breaks down. There's biodegradable plastic, but that actually just makes it into smaller pieces of plastic. And so I think that's harder to remove if you're trying to. So that's another issue. So they're all doing the same thing. They're preventing light and water sometimes from getting to the weed seed so that it doesn't germinate, or if it does germinate, it dies. But again, cost and preference come to be kind of big things there. Chlorine bleach in the grocery store will work, but it is not technically allowable. In terms of specific diseases that get in the soil, the root rots are in the soil, and there's a few other things that do that too. Cold temperatures below freezing will kill some things, but if you think about botrytis in peony, for example, forms this kind of little black, lumpy shaped resistant structure. It is designed to survive. It is designed to survive the environment that it's in. So they survive very well in our below freezing temperatures. So that's not enough to control those. Freezing temperatures don't technically disinfect. They may kill some of the organisms. And temperatures that go up and down are actually tougher for things like insects, because if it's come into an active stage and then you get freezing temperatures, it's more likely to be killed than if it's at the resistant stage and it's cold and it just stays there. So freezing temperatures always seem like a good thing, and that they would kill all sorts of stuff, but they don't. They'll kill some, but not all. In biological control, which is near and dear to my heart, but I'm not talking about it very much today, there's two things that we're looking at: resistant varieties, and then using beneficial pathogens, insects or mites. And so we don't have as many species as it would be nice to have resistance. And it's more often resistance to disease organisms than there is resistance to insects. This is an example of a trial showing the center variety is resistant. It's a verbena, I believe, resistant to powdery mildew. And you can see how much different it looks than the two varieties on the other side, either side, that are not resistant. And so the nice thing about a resistant variety is that the pest management is built into it. So it's not that it will necessarily have no effect of an insect or disease. More cases, I said more likely to be a disease, but certainly less. And so it certainly reduces the amount of management that's required. We've been working on a lot of these disease and insect resistant ornamental plant fact sheets, and then we're now working on some herbaceous ones. So they're not out yet, but they will be coming out. So for example, here's one on peony. We do have botrytis in there, which is a big issue in peony. And I can't see the top of this one, so I can't see what the disease is. It's a leaf blotch. Whoops. Leaf blotch. And so what we've done is gone through all the resources that we can find, and taking, so these numbers are all particular resources. And so, okay, so this resource says that Gigantea is resistant to leaf blotch. And then someone else said that Jules Cabot is intermediate, and someone else said Livingston is susceptible. Sometimes we find different resources that have different opinions, but you can at least get a general idea of whether what you're buying is resistant or susceptible. The other thing that comes into this is, do we know the information on the varieties that you really want to be growing? So, and I realize everybody's looking very closely at this. So I have to get this out and send it out to Carla's listserv once we get it all evaluated, so you can see all the information more easily. But so, you know, if you have a particular variety you want to grow and you just don't know any information about whether it's resistant or susceptible, it makes life a little bit difficult. But we're trying to, it's hard to find this information, which is why we're trying to put it all together. Natural enemies, there's lots of them out there, and we can tell from growing things in structures and then bringing them outside and seeing them get cleaned up from insect pests. There's a lot of stuff out there that's working for you. One of the big issues is to not kill off what you've got. So you can use, if you're using pesticides, you can actually kill off beneficials. And in some cases, we see that somebody uses a pesticide to control one thing, it kills off all the, we see this particularly with spider mites, where the pesticide kills the beneficial mites that are controlling the spider mites. And so you get a big flush of spider mites, because in the process of killing one thing, you've actually killed something you wanted. But the big thing is to know what it is when you're seeing it, so that you're not, so you don't look at it and say, I've got these insects on my plants, I must control them. This is a minute pirate bug. They're really good at feeding on, they feed on thrips, and they'll feed on eggs of other things. And they're very common out in nature. There are also some diseases that can be used to control insects. Some of them are natural, and you'll occasionally see them, but some you can also purchase, and you can purchase many of the natural enemies. It's just awfully expensive, a little bit harder to control if you're doing it for an outside area. Some of them will stay put, some of them won't. But some of the disease organisms like Bavaria bassiana that controls insects is one that you could purchase and use outside if it works for the insect pest you have. And just one of the things in terms of, and again, here's another one where I'll send this link to Carla so that she can send it out to you. This is a really nice one that's put up by Oregon State. There are lots of others. I like this one because they had it originally anyway. They had it set up so you could cut it and punch a hole in it and make yourself a little guide that you could carry around. You could laminate it and carry it around. And it shows you the different stages of the insects that are the good ones. It also, at least the old one, used to show you things that look kind of like them, the good ones, so that you're not getting confused between good guys and bad guys. So finding some information on how to tell what's out there and whether it's a good guy or not is useful. Okay, let's see. There's so many varieties of peonies. Yep. And yes, how they grow in your location. You can be in the same zone and have them not grow well in your spot versus somebody pretty close to you. So that's part of the learning curve of knowing what to grow. So pesticides, I'm mostly talking about not specific pesticides because it's such a huge issue, but kind of what you need to know. And I found in some cases that the information, again, being put out for cut flower growers on pesticides seems to be kind of lacking. And there's a lot of information that's out there that's not necessarily from research-based information, and that has potential to cause problems. So if you're looking at an actual pesticide that's labeled as a pesticide and it has a label, there's information that you need to know to use it legally. And this always seems like, I'm the whoever, somebody just said to me, I'm not the boss of that. Well, I'm not the boss of it, but it is something that's important to know. So you actually have to have a pesticide that's labeled for the crop that you're using it on. So food crop and ornamental pesticides are often not the same. And if you're on a farm that's growing both vegetables and cut flowers, it may be the same active ingredient, but technically you cannot use it on an ornamental if it's labeled for a vegetable crop. That's usually because of going the other way, is they've tested the ones for vegetable crops for residues as if you're going to eat the plant, and they don't have to do that with ornamentals. The other thing is sometimes if it's not labeled for that crop, and this does happen a lot in floral crops, does it cause phytotoxicity? And part of it, I think, is because we grow so many different varieties and species that they haven't tested it on everything. So it's something that if you're trying something new and you're not sure, I would test it on a few plants rather than all of them to make sure that it doesn't damage them. That information, any information they have, is usually on the label. And then what formulation is it? Do you have to water it in? Can it be washed off the foliage with rain? And I apologize to the people that are taking the cut flower class because they've seen most of this already. What rate do you need to apply it for? Make sure your sprayers are calibrated so you know what they're putting out, but also trying to figure out if you're looking at row length as a measure and it's telling you an amount per acre, that's difficult. So yeah, Kathy says she grows flowers and veggies mixed to help with the insects. So there's a problem if you're looking at pesticide use. There are some that are labeled for both, but you need to look that up. How many times can you apply it in a growing season or over an acre? Because they're trying to reduce the development of resistance to those pesticides so they still work. And then things like, is it affected by your soil type or by your water pH? Again, this is mind exploding kinds of levels of information. What else do you need to know? You need to know what personal protective requirement you're required to wear when you're applying it. That, of course, is really for your protection. So you don't want to be applying something that says you need to be wearing goggles and gloves or a Tyvek suit without it. The next thing is, how soon can you go back into the field after you've applied it? So again, protection for the applicator. And then how soon can you harvest it after you've applied it? Again, looking at residues and any kind of residual activity that would be on the plant material. In terms of the things that are important with herbicides, you're trying to kill a plant within an area of plants. So it might be that you're looking at timing. Do you put them on before you've planted your cut flowers so that they're going to prevent the germination of weeds? Or do you put them on after your cut flowers are there and you're doing something to either shield the plants that you want, or it's a different type of pesticide? It's a grass herbicide, it's a grass herbicide and you're growing broadleaves. Are you doing some kind of a wicking method or spraying where you're not contacting the plants that you want? is there potential for drift, in which case you need to be even more careful when you're applying it around your plants. And in terms of insecticides, it depends on the insect and what mode of action we're looking at to control those things. So there are some that actually interrupt the nervous system of the insect. That always worries me because I have a nervous system too. There are some that actually act like juvenile hormones and they interrupt the development of the insect. So knowing what you're looking at, and just because something's on the label that says you can use it on that doesn't mean that it will work very well. We don't have efficacy data on the labels. They've done the tests and they found out that it does something, but it doesn't necessarily tell you that it's the best thing. That is a problem that we have, and it's often very, very difficult to find efficacy data. We're trying to gather that as well. Is it a contact insecticide, so it touches the insect and kills it, or the insect touches it by feeding on plant material that has it? Does it move through the plant? So if it's a contact one, it's on the outside of the plant. If it's a systemic one, it moves throughout the plant. So if you apply it to the soil, it'll still be on the top leaves. That has some advantages in terms of making sure that you have good access to contact the insect pest. But is it a different kind of chemical? How fast does it work? Some things they're pesticides and they're meant to kill them, but they don't kill them instantly. And we sometimes expect if it's a pesticide, you're going to put it on and they're going to be dead. That's also not always true. And what stage of the insect does it work on? It may only affect eggs, or it may only affect the young larvae. And so you need to know that again in terms of what stage you have of the insect and when you're applying it. We do have a resource, and it's not on this one, called the Environmental Impact Quotient, where you can kind of compare the environmental impact of different pesticides. But it's on the New York State Integrated Pest Management website. Fungicides, again, can be contact or systemic. They can be broad or narrow spectrum. So some have an effect on many different kinds of fungi, and some have an effect just on a few. They also have modes of action. Again, may not be important for you to know what the mode of action is unless you're looking at using a variety of fungicides and knowing whether you're using always the same mode of action or a variety of modes of action. And that which gives you a benefit of, if one mode of action has an effect on this type and you put something else and it kills the rest of them, then you get better control. There aren't many bactericides. There are a few antibiotics, like streptomycin. I just put that under microbials, but it should be an antibiotic. It's copper, and then some microbials like Bacillus subtilis, which is interesting. It's like, wait, that's a bacillus, so that's a bacteria also, but it's actually competing with or actually killing the bacteria. And then for viruses, we have essentially none. And what often we're doing is preventing transmission by reducing the insects. Sorry, I'm getting to the end here. Preventing transmission by killing the insects with insecticides. Control of mammals and birds. Look at that cute little deer. You still have things like fencing are going to be a good one, but expensive. You can remove habitat, but often what you're growing is what they want to be in, and often close enough to where they will cross quite long distances to get to something they really want. And then things like chemical management is actually labeled as pesticides, and so you need to follow those rules as well. And this is something that I have seen a lot of and hear a lot of, that lots of people have home remedies for things. And this is just a quote from what it's like, here's our favorite homemade recipe. We use it on all these things. Be careful of spraying it on the foliage because it'll burn it. Well, yeah, that's kind of the point. And so I've seen, I don't know why it's always Dawn dish detergent, but Dawn dish detergent is promoted very highly for use for pest management and cut flowers. Dawn detergent is meant to cut grease, and the surfaces of plants are greases and waxes. And so you can burn plants. And I did have somebody tell me that they'd put it on their zinnias and they burned the whole crop. So there are soaps that are developed for use on plants that don't have all the things in it that something that's used to clean dishes does. And so use the right things. That's the biggest thing, is use the right things. And if it's used as a pesticide, it has to have a pesticide label. I put this in just to kind of show examples of some of the things that are on labels. So up in the top, it actually tells you what group it is. So what the mode of action is. It tells you what the active ingredient is and how much is in there. So this Pyganic, this is 1.4% of the active ingredient. So most of what you're buying is not. There's also Pyganic 5.0, which has 5% of the active ingredient. Tells you what the active ingredient is. There's lots of information on, like the word caution in this case on a pesticide label has a specific meaning. It gives you the first aid for if it's misused. It tells you what personal protective equipment you need to be wearing. And then it will list things like the environmental hazards. So for example, this one it has an effect on bees. And so they tell you not to put it on blooming crops while bees are foraging. You're growing blooming crops. And so you can apply it when the bees are not foraging, but that's something to note, to think about. You need to think about how not to have effects on bees and other environmental aspects of it. And so it sometimes makes it more complicated. This tells you things like how often you can reapply it in a season or for how many days between sprays, how to apply it, how to keep people protected when you're applying it. And then I put the picture of this is what Cornell does. We tend to call it the Cornell guidelines or the recommends. They put them out for lots of different crops. So there is one for herbaceous ornamentals. It's not necessarily aimed directly at cut flowers, but it has actually lots and lots of information. This is one of the pages just to show you in terms of they're looking at what can you use to control alternaria leaf spot. It's got management options. It's got a lot of integrated pest management in there, where you can use it, what conditions it might be a problem, and then a list of the pesticides and at least some of the trade names, active ingredients, and at least some of the trade names of what you can use to control them. It's a great question. Are using beneficial insects to control unwanted insects still safe for bees? Yes, most of them are very specific on what they're controlling, and we don't see many of that actually affect bees. So, yep, that's a good question. Deer is the bane of many people's existence. And so, yes, hunting is acceptable. And yeah, if you get rid of the deer, you will find that other things will move in. So let's see, I'm pretty much at the end of my time. I put a chunk in on powdery mildew, but I think what I'm going to do first is see if there's questions, because I don't want to steal Fran's time. I think I've hit some of the comments and questions as we've gone along.
Yeah, you've been keeping up with them.
I think there were a couple of questions up in the chat that weren't answered about bleach and freezing temperatures and things.
Yeah, I think I talked about those a little bit, that freezing temperatures will kill some things, but there are many diseases that are adapted to survive in our environment, and they'll survive freezing. Either they're protected somehow, or they're dormant somehow. And that, yeah, chlorine bleach that you can buy does work, but it's technically not allowed. Anybody have other questions? Did we just blow everybody's minds?
Oh, a couple of them just came in.
Oh, shipment covering gray mold. So if it's kind of fuzzy and gray, that sounds like botrytis. Botrytis, I don't know what it's a shipment of, Laura. If I had a shipment coming in with gray mold, I wouldn't accept it. Because now you're fighting something that's already there. I can't exactly tell you what it is, but I'm guessing, is it a shipment of bulbs or just a shipment of plants? Kind of late for getting a shipment of plants, I guess. Oh, flowers, Veronica. Yes, that's the other problem. You don't know until you unboxed it. So, botrytis is my best guess, but it is a guess. And so there are, depends if you're willing to use pesticides. If you can dry out the plants and keep them in a not too humid area with lots of good airflow, the new growth may outgrow it. So yeah, those are I mean, the other thing is to send in a sample to make sure you know what it is, or send pictures. You can send them to me. I'm not probably the best ones. Yeah, botrytis survives and thrives in the shipment of cut flowers, because you think about the humidity in those. And so if there was a little botrytis on them, now you've put them in a perfect environment for botrytis to grow. But yes, yeah, Fran, you're right. What you really need to do is get a refund. Take pictures if you need to send them. My opinion on spinosad, Joanne, I don't exactly know what you mean. I mean, if I could tell everybody how to do their pest management without using any pesticides, I would. Let's see. And then farm caps help with moles, mice, and some insects. Yeah. Oh, you're lucky you're in spotted lanternfly area. You're not yet. Well, no, that's not quite true. I think it does have them. Peaches probably don't love spotted lanternflies. It might be the other way around. We don't see spotted lanternfly in terms of damaging cut flowers much. It could make them messy and we don't, I mean, they tend to feed more on trees. So I haven't heard of specific issues with spotted lanternflies, but things are just coming along. Use and safety. Oh, Peaches is one of your barn cats. Okay, so then maybe Peaches does love spotted lanternflies. I don't know. Hopefully they're not eating them. But yeah. So use and safety of spinosad. There are certainly ways to use it safely, and I'm not giving you any very much in the way of specifics because I don't have really enough specifics to go on in terms of to tell you how I think it should be used. If you're following the label, that should be a safe way to use it. So I don't know, Joanne, if you have more information you can put in there. I learned about Mars and Vulcan, who are Carla's cats, last night.
My wreath sitting cats. They've been taking turns sitting in a fall wreath on the couch. It's
Yeah,
comical.
it's nice that they're taking turns.
Yeah.
All right, why don't we hand everything over to, I'll stop sharing and we'll hand everything over